Great. So thanks everybody for joining. Welcome to our session on the evolving marketplace. For those of you who have not met yet, I'm Mike Luca. I'm an economist at Harvard Business School, and my research focuses on the design of online platforms. I'm joined today in this session by my two fellow panelists, Professor Beibei Li, who is an associate professor of IT and management at Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Li's research interests lay at the intersection of social and technical aspects of information technology. So I think is going to very much be complementary to some of the other discussions that have been going on over the course of the conference. Also joined by Hyunjin Kim, who is a strategy scholar and has been doing a lot of interesting work on the role that information plays in markets. So Hyunjin is going to be starting a position in July. So congrats, Hyunjin. The motivation for this session is pretty simple and based on a phenomenon that the three of us had kind of in parallel been working on. In recent decades, we've seen the rise of platforms such as Airbnb and Uber. And what we've seen is that they've allowed for new ways to transact, but they've also raised a number of important questions. So questions about the design choices that platforms are making and about the data they're using, how they can use and how they importantly could use it. We've also seen more traditional marketplaces going through a digital transformation and thinking about the ways that they could use data and technology at their disposal. So in this session, essentially what we're going to do is be focusing on one part of this, which is the role that information has been playing in the design choices that organizations have made. And we're going to look at this from three different perspectives. Professor Li is going to discuss her research on the use of new data sources that is increasingly being used to target customers in offline marketplaces. Hyunjin will be discussing her research, how firms use accessible data, how they've been getting it in an offline world, and how in an online world, it's easier to get this data, how they're using it, and what barriers there might be to effectively using new information. And I'll be discussing some of the work that I've been doing on discrimination in online platforms over the last few years. So without further ado, what I was going to do is just hand it over to Professor Li to give the first talk, then Hyunjin is present, then I'll then we'll have time for discussion at the end, but please do enter questions or comments in the chat as we go along. So maybe you.
Thank you, Mike, for the very nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. Are you able to see it? Great, great. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First, thank you, Mike and Jim, for organizing this session, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to join you. I'm very excited to look forward to the interesting discussion. So I'm Beibei Li. I'm associate professor at Carnegie Mellon. So a lot of my research are focusing on the sort of interaction between human decisions and the disruption of technologies in the market. Today, I would like to share with you some recent studies that we did looking at the potential of mobile technologies and sensor technologies in general, and the mobile platforms, how these new technologies can facilitate the information collection and sharing in the market, and try to help us better understand customers' preferences and to better design efficient sort of market strategies to improve the efficiency of transactions in the market. So by the way, feel free to raise any questions if you have any to. So right. So here's a quick background. Right? So I think with nowadays everyone in the country and in the world, almost everyone has a mobile phone, and mobile technologies and the sensors and smart web sensor technologies are changing how individuals and the customers behave in the market. Right? So a recent study by eMarketer showed that consumers have been increasingly use mobile devices to locate and buy product, which have pushed the revenues up to more than $100 billion by the year 2017. And this number has been even higher up to date. And by end of last year, 2019, there have been more than 1 billion mobile coupon users, right, in the States. So obviously there's a dramatic increase in the kind of the adoption and usage of mobile devices and the application in the market. So this pervasive adoption and ubiquitous adoption and usage of these smart and connected mobile technologies have also led to a pervasive and fine-grained digitization of customers' behavior across both online and offline markets. So as Mike mentioned, I think one of the really interesting things to us was how this new source of information really helps the market design and help us to understand better consumers' preferences, right? So thanks to the advanced sensors, Bluetooth, Internet of Things, and these very interesting mobile location tracking technologies, they provided really great opportunities for us and for the firms to be able to monitor, understand, and optimize the decision-making process. Okay? So in specifically, they help us to better understand customers' preferences in the market and to also better design the personalized deals and the promotions and to facilitate transactions with customers in the market. So in this study, I'm going to show you an example of how we sort of try to looking at these this new source of information and how we leverage that to improve the market design, right? So this is a just to show you the context of the study that we conducted. This is a randomized field experiment that we conducted in a large shopping mall. This is not exactly the picture of the mall that we conducted our study for privacy concern that we won't be able to reveal the identity of the mall, but this is a very similar setting just to give you a sense, right? So this is a very popular large shopping mall in the city center of Beijing in Asia, right? So as you can see, right, so basically the kind of question that we're looking at is, can we improve the mobile targeting for advertisers and for shops, for retailers in a shopping mall, right? So what happens is currently, right, the state-of-art approach, most of these advertisers and these businesses in the real world, the offline market, what they're doing is, if you see those blue dots in the picture, right? So this is basically individual customers standing in front of an Apple store. Right, the state-of-art approach is basically says, hey, if this customer is walking close to my store, in this case, the Apple store, standing next to my store or standing in front of my store, inside my store, close enough to my store, I'm going to just send him a targeted mobile coupon, right? Because he's so close to my store. Right? So this is in general called mobile targeting or mobile fencing, right? Geofencing, right? The way that the mobile promotion messages are sent was triggered by some predefined distance range. So if you're close enough to my store within a predefined distance range, then the ads will be triggered and sent to your phone. Right? So this is how the current marketers is communicating with their mobile users. Right? However, as you can see, this approach is quite noisy. There's a lot of false positives, right? So because many times we sort of like to meet with our friend, hey, meet me near the Apple store. We use the store as an anchor to meet up with our friends, or maybe we just happen to walk by near across this store, right? So really there's nothing to do with my preferences of buying a product in the store, right? So because of this kind of limitation of the current approach, right, so the effectiveness of this design is actually pretty low. Right? So, however, right, so if you think about as a store or a shop or advertiser, right, so if in addition to that this user standing in front of your store, but if you actually know that, hey, before he go to your store, he actually visited this Simpson store on the second floor. Right? And then he went downstairs and get a Starbucks coffee. And then he went upstairs to AT&T store and stayed 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And then he went back in front of your Apple store, right? So if we were able to observe these, we call it a trajectory of movement of these customers. And that would actually allow us to know a lot more about this individual's preferences. So here we can pretty confidently say that this individual might be interested in buying a mobile phone. And he's sort of comparing different brands and doing a price comparison or quality check. And then he's going to Apple Store at this moment, right? So it's actually quite interesting that with the current mobile and the technologies and the sensor technologies, we're actually, as a firm, as a business, we're able to collect these kind of detailed movement trajectory information about your customers. And you are actually you're a lot better off if you are able to use this kind of information to infer the preferences of your consumers, and then you can better tailor the kind of pricing or advertising strategies to your customers. So that's kind of the motivation, the overall motivation of our work, right? So the fundamental question we're trying to ask is, are we able to better infer the consumer preferences based on the new source of mobility data, this mobile trajectory data that are enabled by the new mobile and sensor technologies today, right? So more specifically, right, so we're asking three set of questions. The first, are we able to extract consumer preferences from such large scale, fine-grained individual mobility data? And second, if we are able to analyze this kind of new source of data, are we able to design a better advertising strategy that allows firms to leverage not only the static location and context information about consumers, right, about where they are right now, but also incorporating their past mobile trajectory data, right? So basically the entire trajectory of their movement. And finally, how effective is this strategy in terms of improving market efficiency? So can we evaluate this from a causal perspective, right? What's the impact on the consumer shopping behavior and business revenues in general? So this is basically the general overview of the study. So I'm going to quickly introduce the kind of technologies that we're using. Is a combination of AI and machine learning on how to extract these consumer similarities and making recommendations using a trajectory-based clustering algorithm. And then based on that, we build a new recommendation approach and try to see if this will work, right? So we run a randomized field experiment in the shopping mall to test our results, right? So first of all, right, how do we really model consumer similarity from these mobile trajectories for the recommendation approach? The idea is very simple. We call it great minds move alike. So basically, the way we model the similarity is the following. So we define a community of consumers as a set of similar consumers with similar movement patterns. Right? These movement patterns, basically we look at their mobile trajectories in history and how similar they are. Right? So basically all the trajectory within the same community will indicate very similar consumer behaviors among the consumers. Right? So as you can see, very importantly, one thing that are really important is how do we define the similarity, right? So we define a pairwise similarity between two consumers as sort of a function of different aspects of individuals' movement pattern, right? So for example, if two consumers visited a similar store, like a women's shoe store, they must share some similar preferences, right? If two consumers visited a store at a similar time, for example, both visited on the weekends versus weekdays, or mornings versus afternoons, that also indicates some similarity in their behavior, right? And moreover, if we observe two consumers move at a similar speed, right? So if they, for example, stop time by time, walk very slowly, that may have a strong indication like both of them are explorers of the store. They're just kind of exploring the store, right? So the goal is trying to use AI technology to extract these different perspectives of the features from people's mobile, this mobile phone data, this location trajectories, right? So specifically, we look at 4 different dimensions of these movement features. The first dimension is time, right? So temporal dimension. We look at the starting time and ending time of your shopping trip, and also the time day indicators to sort of control for the time related variables. And we also look at the spatial features, right? So basically how far are we between you and me, right, over time, the distance between two consumers over time. We call it spatial alignment, right? So notice that if we observe, basically the idea is if we observe two consumers, they tend to co-locate at a lot of different places. Then that's a strong indicator of these two consumers have shared some similar interest in the shopping journey, right? So one thing to note is sometimes if the store is super popular, like a Starbucks, right? So everybody goes there. So if this is the case, then if you observe two people visited a super popular store like Starbucks, maybe not that informative that to indicate people's similarity, right? Because everyone goes there anyway. So to account for this, right? So on the other hand, if they both visited a very niche store, like a high-end jewelry store, for example, right? Then that might be a higher indicator of people's similarity because not a lot of people going there, right? So to account for this popularity of the store, we kind of inversely weigh the spatial alignment by the crowdedness of the environment, right? So if basically we want to inversely weigh the popularity of the store, right? The third dimension that we look at from the mobility data is the thematic dimension. So we want to basically account for example, the distribution of people's visitation probability to each store, and also time spent at each store, and transition probability between store A and store B, and also time spent to transit from store A and store B. So these are basically trying to control for the further popularity and the correlations and all these relationship among different stores. The final dimension that we extract from this data is called velocity, right? So essentially, this is the speed of travel. We also try to normalize this by the travel length, right? So the idea here is, as you can see, we sort of just use the new machine learning method to try to extract very interesting new features from people's movement pattern and use that to measure the similarity among individuals and try to link that to people's shopping preferences, right? So once we extract these 4 different dimensions, we come up with a weighted combination of these 4 dimensions, and then we derive a pairwise similarity score between each 2 consumers, right? So as we can see here, basically, once we know this similarity score, we adopted a graph-based clustering AI method to extract similar communities. Basically, this is a community detection method based on graph, right? The idea is quite intuitive, right? So essentially, we build an undirected graph with each node in this graph representing a consumer. And between 2 consumers, there's an edge between 2 nodes. And then there's a weight assigned to each edge, right? So basically this weight of the edge between 2 nodes is in proportion to the pairwise similarity score between the 2 consumers, right? So the idea of the algorithm is quite intuitive, right? So basically it's based on a random walk. So we start with a random node in the graph, and then the probability of walking from one node to another is in proportion to the weight of the edge between 2 nodes, right? So the intuition is if 2 consumers are very similar to each other, then there is a higher chance to link these 2 nodes in the graph based on the random walk, right? So if we have these algorithms run for a while, it will converge to local clusters of sort of the subset of the communities. These are the similar consumers based on our algorithm, right? So basically that's the overall intuition of the methodology, right? So I know this might be a little bit technical, right? So just give you a quick recap what we have done so far, right? So basically we use the mobile devices to track individuals' mobility location trajectory data, right? So these data are basically location points, longitude and latitude with a time step. And for each individual, we have a very long time series of these kind of data, right? We track them when they get into the mall and then all the way when they get out of the mall, right? So these are basically Wi-Fi based tracking, right? So the input of this whole system is basically this raw location data for each individual. And then we extract 4 dimensions of the mobility features, right? Their time dimension, the spatial dimension, the semantic dimension, and also the velocity, the speed dimension. And then we sort of have a weighted combination of these 4 dimensions. We come up with a final measurement of a pairwise similarity score. And then we put that into a graph-based clustering algorithm. And at the end, what we want is the similar customers based on the mobility features. Okay, so that's basically this entire AI system that we are able to identify similar users afterwards. Right? So after that, we are able to make mobile recommendations based on similar consumers. Right? The idea is very simple, very straightforward. Basically, we recommend to our consumer stores or products that are most frequently visited by similar consumers. So if Mike and Beibei are very similar in terms of our mobility patterns, right, then we're going to recommend whatever Mike like to Beibei, right? So that's a very simple idea. It's actually a classic algorithm in a recommender system called the collaborative filtering approach, right? So basically, this is what we did so far, right? So the $1 million question is whether or not it works, right? So we sort of ran a field experiment and try to evaluate this methodology, this new algorithm. Right? So this experiment was done in Beijing back in 2006. And this shopping mall is in the city center of Beijing, covers about 1.3 million square feet with 300 stores. And it's a popular store with more than 100,000 visitors per day. And during holidays, this number doubled or tripled. Right? So as I mentioned, basically there's a Wi-Fi system in the mall, which is free Wi-Fi. So sort of people opt in. And once they link to the Wi-Fi system, we actually, from the IT, we can actually track their location trajectory information. Right? So here's a visualized some of the user data that I just want to give you a sense. Right? So each line represents an individual's trajectory. As we can see, we can notice the user can go upstairs and downstairs and move around in the mall. These 2 different colors represent the 2 clusters that we identified. So these are the 2 set of customers with 2 different typical behaviors. Right? So we have actually implemented 4 experimental groups. The first one is basic control group. We didn't do anything. It's our baseline. We just observe their purchase behavior. And then we have 3 treatments. The first treatment is sort of like a placebo treatment. We just send them random coupon. Okay? And the second treatment, we send them based on the industry state-of-art approach, we send them coupon based on where they currently are located. So if they're near Starbucks, they get a Starbucks coupon. Okay? The third treatment group is based on our trajectory-based recommendation. Okay? So there's some more details about the experiment. I'm just not going to talk about all the details. Right? So we basically conducted this first 14 days. We collected responses from over 83,000 users. And what do we find? Right? Basically, we find the good news is people really like the trajectory-based recommendation on average. Right? So it leads to higher promotion response rate. And interesting, also faster redemption action. This seems to make the transaction really much more efficient. Right? We also find that people spend less time in the advertising store, but they spend more. And then they have additional bandwidth to go to visit the other part of the mall. They spend more money in the mall in general and spend more time in the mall. We also find people in general leads to a higher satisfaction rate based on this. We also find that the current location-based advertisement still work better than the random ads. The random ads leads to the lowest satisfaction rate, which is not surprising. It's kind of annoying to the users. We do observe significant heterogeneity in the demographic groups as well. So age has a negative effect, but it's a diminishing over the years. And female in general are more responsive to coupons, right? So they just respond more. Very interestingly, we also find there is something that counterintuitive to us at the beginning. Right? So we find that mobile trajectory-based advertising becomes less effective during the weekend. And after looking into the data further, we noticed that indeed, actually, in many other existing literature and disciplines, we find a significant weekend effect where people tend to behave quite differently during the weekend. Right? So potentially the explanation we found was consumers sort of go to the mall during the weekend without a planned purchase, right? So they kind of go there for exploration. They go there for fun. So as a result, that leads to a lot of impulse purchases. However, if you target them with a very closely targeted behavioral ads like mobile trajectory-based ads, it can limit the scope of exploration and can hurt impulse purchase during the weekend. So that's something we learned, that this technology may not always work, right? So during certain period and certain time, that we have to be very careful how to design this exact these policies. And finally, we find the trajectory-based advertisement is more effective for male customers and the high-income customers, right? Sort of related to men are in general more utilitarian and goal-oriented during shopping, but women are more hedonic-oriented. So women sort of incur more impulse purchases in that case, right? So, and the men sort of enjoy these closely targeted behavioral ads more, right? So, so finally, as a summary, basically what we did was we tried to show an example of how to leverage these new mobile and sensor technologies to extract consumer preferences from the large fine-grained mobility data. And we show this is a new source of information in the market that firms and companies should pay attention to better understand customers' behavior. And we kind of see this is a great potential that for us to understand the digitization of individuals' offline behavior, right? So considering people incur a much higher search cost in the offline market compared to the online market, we think this new source of information is extremely useful for companies and marketers to design their efficient policies to improve the facility efficient transactions in the market. So I'll stop here. Any questions? We can discuss later as well for this.
Beibei, I was fascinated by the way you did this. The results you found were significant, especially the main result. Are the results large as well as significant? Could you give a sense of the magnitudes?
Yes, so I don't have the time to show the details, but we do find very significant, statistically significant effect, and both statistically and also economically. The scale, as far as I remember, roughly around 30% improvement in the redemption rate.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. If there aren't other questions, we could move on to Hyunjin's talk and then come back at the end for a broader discussion. Thanks, Beibei.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks.
Great. I'm going to try to share my screen. Thanks, Beibei. That was fascinating. Let me know if you can see my screen. Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Mike and the conference organizers for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's a great pleasure to present in this session and to be part of the broader conversation today, which has been fascinating. So as Mike introduced, I'm a researcher in strategy currently at Harvard Business School, and I'll be joining the faculty at INSEAD in a few months. And my broader research agenda studies how firms use data to inform their strategic decisions and what the impact of this more data-rich and data-driven market landscape may be on how firms compete. So one component of my research looks at how there's an increasing amount of readily accessible information on customers, internal operations, and the broader market context. And today, I'll be speaking about one of these projects, which explores how firms use simple information that has become readily accessible. So in recent years, information about the market has become increasingly available at lower cost. Back in the 60s, Sam Walton, who founded Walmart, famously drove around to all of his competitors to collect their prices and observe their decisions. And this is his tape recorder and notebook that's been preserved in the Walmart Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas. But today, across many different markets, like hotels on Expedia, firms can look at their closest competitors, what prices they're charging, and their latest amenities and services, all with a single click. Now, this raises the question, to what extent do firms use readily accessible information on competitor decisions to inform their own decisions? Now, stepping back, this is a nice setting to look at how firms use readily accessible information to inform their decisions overall, because understanding the competitive environment is a central part of how firms strategically respond. And in terms of thinking about competitor decisions on key strategic levers, we've generally assumed that those are known and already incorporated into firm decisions, both in theoretical work as well as in interpretations of empirical results. And as information becomes more easily available, this might be a reasonable assumption. But at the same time, easy availability of information may not equate with use. And there's been limited systematic evidence on whether firms are aware of easily accessible information and how they use it to change their decisions. So in this paper, what we're hoping to do is try to understand, as many markets become more flooded with market information, the extent to which firms use it and what its impact might be, as well as the barriers that firms may have in leveraging potential gains from the information that becomes available. So to give you an overview of where I'm going today, I'll speak broadly about this project that looks at really one particular dimension of this through a field experiment in collaboration with Yelp in the personal care industry, which includes hair salons, barbers, and beauty salons. And this is a setting where pricing is a key strategic lever and depends on both customer demand as well as competitor offerings. So in this setting, I look at whether firms already know competitor prices, which is readily accessible on online platforms like Yelp, as well as through physical channels for many years. And then within that setting, I look at experimentally, once firms are experimentally provided information on competitors, how do they change their decisions? And then to forecast the results a little bit, I'll look into why firms did not use this information on their own, despite the fact that it happened to be readily accessible. Okay, so let's dive in. And there are a number of challenges in terms of empirically identifying firms' knowledge of competitors and how they might use this information to inform their decisions. We need to observe a large sample of firms across markets with different levels of competition. And then within that setting, try to isolate the impact of readily accessible competitor information on their decisions. So in thinking about this, I thought carefully about what setting to explore among the many different local verticals that Yelp has to understand what the impact of readily accessible competitor information might be. And I focused on the personal care industry here for a number of different reasons that makes it a nice setting to empirically measure and identify what the impact of competitor information is. And to give you a little bit of a background on what this industry looks like, this is a fairly fragmented and competitive market, although there are some multinational chains with over 800 establishments and $1 million in revenues. And this is a differentiated market along pricing and quality, which makes it a nice setting to study how firms make decisions on competitive strategy. And these businesses represent mostly entrepreneurial endeavors, often by college-educated immigrants and women, and they make decisions along pricing and quality that are fairly representative of small and medium enterprises, especially in the retail services sector, which represent a large part of the economy. And then finally, these small sellers are also of growing strategic importance for many online platforms, including Yelp, or Airbnb and Amazon, because they rely on them for the seller side of their marketplaces. And this is a setting where increasingly information is getting introduced that may have an impact on how firms make decisions. Now, there are a couple of attributes about this setting that makes it a nice setting to study these questions. The first is that it represents one of the largest local business verticals, and firms compete locally. So here I'm showing you an image of the Upper East Side in Manhattan, where there is a Starbucks located every 2 to 3 blocks. And within that same amount of space, you can see the number of nail salons that exist. And what this gives us is a large sample size of many firms that compete across hundreds of local markets of different levels of competition. And they also have some clear and comparable measures of price positioning as well as quality positioning that's traditionally quite difficult to measure. So for example, every salon has a price for a regular manicure, which is proportional to other prices or other prices, the prices of other services that they charge, which provides a nice measure of price positioning, which is not necessarily the case in even other sort of simple, other industries or simple strategy spaces. And they also have observable and comparable measures of quality positioning along the polished brands they use, as well as the cleanliness of the interior and the luxuriousness of the decor. And using these attributes, I construct a 12-month panel data set of pricing, quality, and performance. First, by collecting monthly data on how prices on regular manicures are changing, using a team of about 50 RAs that are collecting these data through monthly phone calls to ensure their accuracy. And then second, we measure quality by sending physical data collectors at baseline and endline along the 3 dimensions that I mentioned earlier to understand how quality decisions change. And then lastly, I look at some proxies of performance from a number of different sources, including purchase intentions from the Yelp platform, including the number of calls, the number of page views, and map directions, as well as whether the business has availability for an appointment the next day as a measure of customer demand through the business. And then I'm collaborating with the city of San Francisco to get some sales tax data. So within this setting, I run a field experiment collaborating with Yelp across about 3,000 businesses in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, where I send Yelp canvassers to visit every business within the sample for a standard marketing visit, telling them about the Yelp business page and how they can update their information on that page. And firms that are randomly assigned to treatment receive an additional personalized competitor pricing report on the back of this marketing material that provides their relative pricing position compared to their 9 geographically closest competitors with their prices and their names. So for example, this business is called Christoph Salon, and it charges the highest price in the area compared to the 9 geographically closest firms. Now, this is information that in theory, Yelp could easily provide to the firms on their platform, since they collect information about businesses in terms of their customer reviews, as well as their price levels. And it's of course only one dimension that we might focus on. There's a lot of different dimensions about competitor decisions that may be important for firms, but I focus on relative pricing because in this industry, it's a key driver of customer decisions for about 99% of the customers. So here I'm showing you a text analysis of Yelp reviews prior to the experiment to analyze what customers care about in terms of when they search for businesses. And what you can see is that about 46% of reviews mention price and 35% of reviews mention competitors. And some of the most frequent phrases that are mentioned through describe how they're comparing across different businesses. And so this provides a nice test of looking at whether firms use easily accessible information on key levers that they may care about that competitors are doing. So first, to start off, I begin by having canvassers survey treatment businesses to get a sense of whether they in fact know what competitors are charging. Now, when we first begin this, a lot of managers say, I already know this information, either because they've seen it sort of physically passing by the stores, or because they're very much aware of Yelp or other reservation platforms that are available within this industry. But when we first ask them to specify who their primary competitors are and what prices they're charging, about 58% of firms are not able to specifically state what the price is of the key competitors that they believe they compete against. And this persists across firms that face higher levels of competition, as well as larger firms and firms that charge higher end prices. Now, of course, stated measures of knowledge could be inflated. And this could also be because firms don't explicitly need to know competitor decisions, since after all, this information would have been fairly easy for firms to access. And other informative sources like observing customers or residual market demand may offer sufficient statistics for competitor information, especially in more competitive markets. So how do firms change their decisions once they actually receive and are forced to pay attention to the pricing information on their competitors? what I see is that firms that are randomly assigned to treatment are about 17% more likely to change their prices after these canvassing visits that provide that additional back of postcard, compared to the base of about 17% of firms that change prices in the months that follow the canvassing visit. And firms appear to be more likely to increase rather than decrease prices, although they move in both directions. So what this suggests is that some firms indeed did not appear to be aware of competitor information, and that this information is decision relevant since they appear to change their pricing after being given this information. And in terms of how firms are changing their decisions, I look at a couple of different dimensions. First, I look at how they change their prices relative to their nearest competitors by observing whether firms that were charging a lower price relative to their nearest competitor at baseline versus the same price or the higher price respond to the treatment. And what I see is that firms that were either charging a lower or higher price are more likely to change their prices as a result of treatment. And firms appear to move closer to their nearest competitors, where firms that were charging a lower price at baseline are more likely to increase their prices, whereas firms that were charging a higher price at baseline are more likely to decrease their prices, suggesting that as information about competitors becomes more accessible and firms pay attention to it, firms may become more similar and the market might become more competitive. The other dimension that I look at is whether these decisions appear to be improving. So one thing that we can do is map how firms' decisions in terms of their price and quality are aligned. So here I'm showing you a plot of every firm in the sample in terms of where they stand on the quality level, as well as the price. So every dot here represents a firm. And what you can see here is that on average, firms that offer higher quality charge a higher price, as we would expect. But there's a large dispersion of firms across this plot, which remains even when we focus and residualize by the specific area or zip code that they might be in, or each measure of quality alone. And one thing that I can do is construct a measure of how aligned they might be in their pricing and quality by measuring the distance of each firm from where they are to sort of the average of price for their quality bucket within their geographic location. And when I look at that, what I see is that firms that were either over or under pricing relative to their quality level compared to their competitors are most likely to respond to treatment. So those that have what I call above median misalignment in price and quality are more likely to change their prices, both increasing and decreasing prices, suggesting that this information may in fact be improving their decisions as a result of them changing their prices. And I also have some suggestive evidence that is consistent with this, looking at some of the proxies of performance. So first, in terms of the purchase intentions from the Yelp platform, I see that treatment firms see about 15% more calls made to the business, the number of views of their map directions to get to the business, as well as page views. And this is especially driven by firms that were overpricing relative to their competitors at baseline. And I also see that for these treatment firms, the next day availability decreases slightly, suggesting that it's not just from this sort of online activity, but that potentially they're having more customer demand through the businesses. And it doesn't appear to be driven by, say, increased engagement with the Yelp platform. Now, this poses a puzzle. Given that this information appears to be both readily accessible and decision relevant in a way that improves their decisions, then why is it that firms do not pay attention to this information on their own? So I look at some informal interviews across the salons, as well as a follow-up experiment to understand what might be driving this behavior. And what I find is that managers appear to be underestimating the value of paying attention. So what generally happens in these interviews is that many managers will say, I already know these competitor prices and I can look at them very easily on online platforms, sort of confirming that this information appears to be readily accessible. But when they're asked to specify who their primary competitors are and what prices they're charging, fewer are able to answer precisely, similar to a lot of the treatment firms at the beginning of these treatments. Whereas a lot of the managers will say, I thought I knew, but I guess it's now been a few years since I've checked who our competitors are. And what this suggests is that managers appear to hold outdated information that may lead them to believe that they're more up to date until they actively reassess their knowledge. Now, I directly try to test at some of this by using a follow-up experiment across the control firms in my sample, where I asked managers if they want to sign up for this competitor information for free by showing them a sample treatment postcard for a salon that's in a different city. And I randomized whether I asked them to review their knowledge about their closest competitors by asking them to state what their closest competitor might be charging in terms of the regular manicure price. And I randomized whether they review their knowledge before or after being asked to sign up for this information. And some of the early results suggest that firms that are asked whether they want to sign up for this information after being asked to review what they already know are more likely to sign up for this information. And the main reasons that they cite is that they haven't looked at competitors in a while. Now, to recap some of these results, what I find is that firms appear to be unaware of key competitor decisions, which in this case is pricing in this setting, even when this information is easily accessible. Now, these results may be most directly applicable to other small and medium enterprises with similar characteristics. And of course, this is an important segment of the economy. And it's an open question on the degree to which larger firms may be unaware of key competitor decisions that are also readily accessible. Now, in this paper, I study these personal care businesses because they have a simple strategy space that makes it easy to isolate and measure the impact of information on their decisions. Now, larger firms, of course, have much more resources to potentially overcome attentional barriers, but at the same time, they have more complex strategy spaces and many more dimensions beyond pricing that they could potentially lack awareness of. And I find that information on competitor decisions, as it becomes more available, appears to lead firms to move closer to their nearest competitors. And this effect actually is larger in more competitive markets. And then lastly, I provide empirical evidence on how managerial inattention may be driving firms' lack of awareness of competitors, which proposes that firms may become inattentive due to outdated information that leads them to be complacent to new information, and suggests that even in competitive environments, managers may need to worry about inattention to their immediate competitive. Now, to zoom out a bit and connecting to sort of the broader questions in this session, across a number of different markets, information about competitors as well as the broader market context is becoming increasingly available, often through online intermediaries like Yelp. For example, we have Expedia for hotels or Amazon for consumer goods. And many of these platforms are actively introducing information into their marketplaces to provide to the firms or the sellers on their platform. And what these findings suggest is that many firms may be farther away from the productivity frontier than we might expect. And providing them with information about competitors or the market context may help them improve their decisions. But simply making this information accessible or simply having information accessible across many different markets may not be sufficient to change firm decisions. And so while a lot of the conversation has focused on which firms have a lot of data, another important dimension may be which firms can overcome some of these attentional barriers. And how information is designed across marketplaces may be important to understand whether and which firms can overcome managerial inattention and realize some of the potential gains from easily accessible data. Okay, so I'll pause there in case there are any questions.
So I think Guan had a question here about the manager. Is the manager typically the owner?
Yes, so there's a little bit of a heterogeneity. I would say that probably maybe around 80% of the time, the manager is typically the owner, but there are a number of franchises or a lot of those large chains that I talked about, I think, a little bit earlier that have like hundreds of establishments. So they'll have different managers at each store. And there's some heterogeneity in terms of whether that manager has discretion to set their own prices locally versus take the central price that is set by the headquarters.
Mike, could I ask a follow-up? Not quite related, but just another general observation. It's terrific work, so congratulations on this study. And my general observation is that as Yelp and other sites increase transparency, there's a whole antitrust literature, as you probably know, about how that could create anti-competitive effects where if I know that you're going to lower your price, if I do that, then there's no point for me to lower my price. I mean, that's probably outside the current scope, but just as a general thing, your research suggests that more transparency is generally good, but there's probably a limit to that given the antitrust counter-argument. Is that fair?
Yeah, you know, I think as you said, probably the scope of this particular setting and this study can't speak directly to those antitrust concerns. But I think that there has been, you know, in context of the findings here, as well as some of the evidence across other sectors, it might depend a lot on some of the market structure and the attributes of the firms. So here, I think that what we see is that rather than a lot of collusive behavior with firms, say, you know, colluding on setting prices, together, what we see is that it just maybe helps the market become more efficient in terms of a lot of firms that can improve their decisions. But there have been some research across other settings, like, for example, gasoline markets, where I think they have seen some evidence of collusive behavior. It's of course very hard to tease apart whether, you know, these price changes are a result of collusive behavior versus some of the competitive effects. But I think a lot of this research, I think, suggests that there could be a lot of gains that can be had depending on the market context.
If I could just ask a question, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us this overview. I'm struck by a number of parallels to some of the work we've been doing about social media and negotiation, specifically that idea of just the managerial inattention. It's just remarkable, you know, when you talk to leaders, CEOs about, you know, some of the things that are readily accessible out there. You know, they just light up the potential implications. I wonder if you could speak some to you know, how to tie this to specific negotiations applications, or if there are particular sources of data or strategic implications that you could talk about a bit more when it comes to the more sort of head-to-head negotiations context, because this is just, it's sparking so many different thoughts and ideas. So thank you so much, and love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, thanks so much for the question. I think it's fascinating. And of course, negotiations is not my area. So I think here I'm just mostly speaking off the cuff in terms of what I've been learning today and, you know, thinking about how this research might map to some of that. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is there are a number of contexts where firms and managers specifically are engaging in negotiation. So one of the contexts, I think one of the firms that is part of this conference was talking about how there is an app that can potentially mediate some of the negotiation in terms of their firms and their suppliers in procurement. And I think that that has been a large literature and strategy looking at, you know, what enables firms to better negotiate with their suppliers, or potentially also with some of the other competitors or other firms within their industry. And I think that maybe one direction that may be interesting to explore in the future is to understand how the dynamics of these negotiations and their outcomes are affected by the amount of information that each party has and can pay attention to, which may enable sort of one side of the market to better negotiate than another side. And I think that might be one potential direction that might be exciting. But of course, I'm also very interested to hear from all of you about, you know, how this might in other ways connect to negotiation.
Okay, we have time for one more question otherwise we could come back at the end.
I might just kind of elaborate a little bit on this because the work is fascinating, both substantively, but frankly, in both cases, Beibei and Hyunjin, methodologically. And when Ben asked his question about managerial inattention, there's all this information that's out there that's potentially highly relevant. And if you think back to the social media negotiation panel, which we looked at, one of the key sets of questions is, how do you learn who the parties are that are potentially influential? And here, there's, while you focused on larger masses of people, in one case in a shopping in a big shopping mall, and in another case really a competitive market for personal care. There's a lot of the techniques help you characterize different players, and that would be very helpful in in a negotiation. And also with the data from third parties' assessments of some of the key players. For example, looking at Yelp and other evaluative and rating sites, how they view someone or some party that you may be dealing with. Using the techniques that you guys have looked at, you might get a lot of insight. And I think one of the things we focused on was how, for example, individual social media posts or Twitter or other things might be a useful source of information, but that's directly from the sort of counterpart of interest. And this is others' views of the counterpart of interest. And that's, could be, I think, really another source of information that we hadn't thought of. So it's, initially I was struggling because markets are typically far end of the continuum from individual transactions, but I think there's a lot of intersection here. And it's really nice work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the next presentation. I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've been working on for the last few years now, which is related to discrimination in online marketplaces. Just going to share my slides here. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So I think I don't need to say this for this audience and certainly not for today, but the motivation for the talk that I'm about to give is really the fact that there's been a pretty dramatic evolution in the way markets function over the last 10 years or so. We think about the rise of online marketplaces, even going back 20 years, eBays and Amazons of the world, and kind of more recently, platforms like Airbnb, Upwork, Uber. And when thinking about these, now, the area that I've been interested in is the decisions that these marketplaces are making to facilitate transactions between buyers and sellers. So just to give a little bit of an overview of the types of questions that a platform needs to make, and I think this sort of builds on the last talk in the sense that these decisions that kind of decide how much information people get and when they get it. So if you're thinking about designing a platform like an Airbnb, or you've got a couple of main decisions to make. One of them is about the price mechanism. I think this kind of ties pretty directly to negotiation. You sort of decide, should this be an auction, allow for negotiations on the platform, even a question of centralized pricing or decentralized pricing. And just to give a sense of on these dimensions, just think in Uber and Airbnb, they do their pricing. Once you have a general pricing system set, so once you've decided that you're going to have centralized or decentralized pricing, whether you're allowing negotiations or not, you make a second set of choices, which is whether to have a price ceiling or a price floor, or neither. And actually, if you look across platforms and across time, so there have been different decisions that platforms have made around this. So one example that I like to think about is online labor markets, where you could go on and hire a contractor. Now, in a lot of these contexts, the traditional labor laws, at least in the US, don't bind for minimum wage. So it's up to the platform to decide whether there should be a minimum and what the minimum should be. And certainly, if you look kind of globally, there's a range of different rules that countries have. So Odesk, which is now called Upwork, at some point decided that they should have a minimum wage, so imposed a platform-wide minimum wage of $3 per hour. Now, when thinking about that, it doesn't sound like a high minimum wage, but it turned out to be binding for a large number of the transactions that were happening on the platform. Now, once you have your price mechanism set, there's a second set of decisions that platforms need to make, which is thinking about building trust and reputation on the platform. How to know that the person you're buying from is going to be reputable, or the product you're buying is going to arrive as you're expecting it to. And there are a few things that platforms are doing to try to facilitate more information-rich ecosystems. So one is sort of trying to give ratings and reviews of products. Two is trying to give information about the product, or kind of product assurances. And three, more recently, what we've seen is platforms trying to flip over the cards a little bit and tell a little bit more about the seller and the buyer in the transaction. And when thinking about this, there are a bunch of really rich decisions that one could dive into on each of these. But the main thing at a high level that I want people to take away from this is that platforms aren't passive players in the way that transactions work on platforms. They're setting a series of rules, and the rules of the market are essentially going to help shape the outcomes of the transactions. One decision that we've been interested in over the last few years is thinking about the level of anonymity on a platform. And let me just walk through a little bit of the history on this, because I think it sort of gets to the heart of the question we're interested in. When thinking about some of the early platforms, the eBays and the Amazons of the world, they really were known for facilitating arm's length transactions. You could be sitting in Cambridge or Brookline or wherever you are right now and buy a book from Berkeley and know that the book is going to arrive there without really knowing anything about the person that was selling it, or about the place that it was sold from, just by the ratings and the information you had online. And this had a couple of implications. Like, one, it highlighted the promise of the internet in helping to facilitate more efficient markets. You could buy this book from Berkeley in a way that would have been difficult without some sort of a reputation system telling you that you could trust the person who is selling it. But two, the subtler implication that had come out and was described by Morton and Zettelmeyer in the 2003 QME paper was that it would also have the potential to facilitate more fair markets. And the main mechanism that they posited is, now that you're sort of removing some of the things that facilitate discrimination, so seeing somebody's name or their picture, or kind of seeing information about them, that you're allowing an arm's length transaction, removing some of the ability to discriminate, and would see less discrimination in markets as well. And they had documented some evidence of this in the context of car purchases, which is a market where decades of research has shown discrimination coming out in the negotiations that people are having. And they found that when they replicated some of those things, looking at transactions that started offline, they saw some of the discrimination that had been documented earlier. But when they looked at transactions that started online, that a lot of that discrimination was gone. Now, thinking about between then and now, it's quite a few things, and especially kind of the level of anonymity that people have in online transactions. So thinking about how the internet has moved in recent decades, here's a 1993 cartoon that probably some of you know. It says, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." This was published in the New Yorker, and sort of was trying to get at the fact that when you're transacting online, you're essentially anonymous when you're interacting. Now, most people don't know that things changed so much that back in, I think, 2015, the New Yorker commissioned a second cartoon that just said, "Remember when on the internet, nobody knew who you were." We've sort of gone from a world where everything was arm's length and fairly anonymous to a world where there's more and more information and data being used by platforms, whether it's to target you in a mall or to give you information about who you're transacting with. Or in this context, I'm going to be thinking about Airbnb, which is a rich set of information that you're going to be getting about about a person's photo, or getting a person's name, and then deciding whether or not to transact with them. Now, I won't spend too much time on this, but I've become interested in Airbnb, and I think this is a managerially relevant context for a few reasons. One, it's short-term rental marketplace, and as of 2019, it has about 6 million active listings. So just to give a sense of the magnitude of this, you could compare it to something like Marriott, which has about 1.4 million worldwide rooms. So just if you kind of look at like the base numbers, you could see that Airbnb has become an independently pretty large source of rooms. Two, there's been research that started to show what the penetration of Airbnb is across different markets. And if you look at some of the larger markets, it's taking up 20% or more of the total stock of available rooms at a given time. And there's been some evidence that the rise of Airbnb is starting to crowd out things like hotels. So thinking about this, we would like to understand how the design choices that Airbnb makes is going to change the efficiency and the equity of a market. Now, thinking about Airbnb and anonymity, we could kind of compare a transaction on Airbnb relative to transactions that you might have had prior to the age of Airbnb. So there are a few main players here. One is there are guests, and guests are essentially doing what guests always do, which is coming on and searching for a room or an apartment. Two, there are hosts, and hosts sort of are the Airbnb equivalent of a regular bed and breakfast or a hotel. And they're making a few decisions. One, they're posting a room or an apartment. That looks pretty similar to what you would do in any online platform, so in an Expedia or Booking. Two, you could choose to rent out the entire property or just rooms within a property, also a decision you can make elsewhere. You're setting a price. And then this fourth thing is where some of the design choices that Airbnb has made are diverging somewhat from the design choices that earlier platforms have made. So you're allowing somebody considerable discretion about whether to accept or reject a guest. And that feels, at least on the surface, pretty different from an Expedia of the world, where you just kind of enter your information, and if it's available, you book it. And kind of the third player here is Airbnb, and they're essentially the market designer who are making decisions about what information to give to different market participants, and what rules there are about what transactions you can make. Just to give a quick glimpse of what searching on Airbnb looked like, at least at the beginning of our project, you could do a search. This is in Paris, France, looking for a rental. You see a lot of things that just look like Expedia, pictures of the places. You see pictures, a map of Paris. You see prices of the listings. You have these lightning bolts. Those indicate things that look more like Expedia. So these accounted for fewer than 10% of rentals when we started the project. Essentially, what you could do there is if you click on one with a lightning bolt, that's their instant booking feature, which allows you to transact the way that you would on an Expedia or a Booking of the World, where you just see the listing. If it's available, you could book it. Now, the question that we had is, given the fact that Airbnb is allowing you to look at the picture of a person and the name of a person and then decide whether or not to accept them, should we expect discrimination to occur on the platform? And perhaps to occur in a way that wouldn't even be feasible on Expedia, given the design choices that they've made. So Ben Edelman, Dan Svirsky, and I wrote this paper that came out in 2017 that was based on a large-scale field experiment we had run. We randomly drew about 6,400 properties with listed availability for 8 weeks out. And we sent inquiries to people, to different hosts, essentially asking them, is your place still available, which is what Airbnb has suggested for guests to do at the time before confirming a booking. Everything stayed the same except for the name. We used an audit study methodology that Bertrand and Mulanathan had used in labor markets, but where we used names that were statistically indicative of race. So looking at birth records, names that were more common among African Americans and more common among white Americans, and varying that, keeping all else equal. Then we looked for a place about two months out, and we tracked what the response was, and the responses were either yes, you're pre-approved, no, we can't take you, and maybe. We also tracked a few other observational characteristics to merge back with the experimental results, and those included the host and listing characteristics, and we've followed the listings over time to see if it ultimately filled afterwards. The main results were essentially as follows. What we found is that guests with distinctively African-American names are accepted about 16% less often than those with distinctively white names. And so looking at this, it feels like there's fairly widespread discrimination on the platform. Then we wanted to see, are there conditions under which we're more or less likely to see discrimination? So we have several analyses that you could look at in the paper, but just to give an overview of what we were looking at, we saw that Black and white hosts both seemed to be discriminating. That discrimination persisted both with experienced and new hosts in shared and separate properties, expensive and cheap properties, and diverse and homogeneous neighborhoods. This is the point where we started to think, oh, wow, this is a tricky situation where it seems to be occurring in a lot of different areas. I won't show all the data, but just to give a sense of what the results look like, here's a plot of acceptance rates by the race of the guest and by the price of the listing. So what you could see is that with the price of the listing, that the overall acceptance rates seem to change across prices, but the level of discrimination at least to a first approximation, feels like it's consistent across like the full distribution of prices. Then we wanted to get a little more context around discrimination. And we wanted to see, are people discriminating just because they think it's cheap to discriminate and they're just going to fill their listing with somebody else afterwards? So we looked at the probability of finding another guest, and then we saw that only about 35% of people who rejected our guest ended up with another guest. And the main thing we want to get out of this is that it seems like you are, as a host, leaving some money on the table by discriminating. Then what we wanted to do is compare our results with some of the observational data that we pulled off of the website. And what we could do is see, based on the ratings that have been left for hosts previously, what percent of their past guests have been white and what percent have been Black. And what we could see is that the discrimination was driven predominantly by people who had never had an African-American guest. And for us, this was important for two reasons. First, it allowed us to cross-validate our experimental results against the broader patterns that we were seeing on the platform. And second, one of the things that people had been mentioning to us in the research is that one possible reason there might be discrimination is because, say, people statistically had different experiences with Black and white guests. Now, the fact that we saw that discrimination was predominantly occurring among hosts who had never had an African-American guest suggests that there was little opportunity for this type of learning. So to the extent that their beliefs about what the experience would look like would affect their decision about whether to accept or reject a guest must be coming from broader stereotypes rather than something that they're learning in the context of their Airbnb experiences. Now, sorry, stepping back from these results, here's a little bit of context of, is this a big result or a small result? And how we rewound before the time that Airbnb was popular and just run the same experiment on Priceline or Orbitz, we would see zero discrimination because Airbnb makes different design choices than Priceline or Orbitz, and the decisions that Priceline was making about this essentially prohibit the type of discrimination that we were seeing. But as a marketplace, Airbnb is making these decisions, which presumably were done in an effort to build trust. Kind of the types of things they're thinking about is what information to give, when, and how to provide it. So I see a question coming in about the global landscape of discrimination research now, so I could come back to that at the end. So after we had done this first round of research, we started having conversations with Airbnb, having conversations with other stakeholders, and thinking about potential solutions to reducing discrimination in online platforms. We wrote a series of papers on this, thinking about a few different options. Just at a high level, the types of things we were thinking about is controlling the information flow and salience. So times where you might want to shut off the valve and provide a little bit less information or make certain information a little bit less salient to market participants. Further automate transactions. So remember the lightning bolt where you could automatically book a place. So you could imagine trying to get more people to opt into this instant booking feature. Third thing is trying to make the discrimination policies more salient. When we started this research, the terms of service on different platforms were a little bit vague about what the rules were around discrimination. So having discrimination policies that were both clear, but also delivered to people at the right time. And fourth, improving other components of the reputation system. So providing other valuable information that you think might reduce the need to rely on a heuristic, like looking at somebody's race or gender to decide whether or not they'd be a good guest. Now, managerial decisions are one big part of this. There are also a pretty rich policy landscape that was evolving in light of all this. I think kind of the evolving policy landscape is something that's come up over the course of this conference, but the way that it manifests here is thinking about, are there people that would be liable for discrimination on the platform? Policymakers at the time were thinking about enforcement of existing policies. So if you have many listings on Airbnb, you may be subject to the same discrimination policies that any bed and breakfast or hotel might be subject to. The other is platform liability, and there's an evolving legal literature on this too, thinking about what what Airbnb's role and responsibility is all in all this. And I should mention that a few regulatory agencies were actively at the time then thinking about whether or not they have a case against Airbnb. So it's both an academic matter, but also a practical one that organizations were thinking about. Now, just diving a little bit more into the solution space, I want to just spend a minute thinking about some of the more granular things that you as a market designer, or here I'm thinking about choice architects, might do. There are a lot of small decisions that Airbnb is making that might end up being important. So one is thinking about the choice of default options. So you could default a host into instant booking. Instead, they had been defaulting hosts not to be instant booking. Defaulting guests into searching for instant booking. So once a market is thick enough with people who are open to doing instant booking, you could try to just tip the market by having guests come in and only search for instant booking unless they press a button to search for other things. And I should mention, both of these were things that Airbnb was actively experimenting with in response to our research. Second bucket of things is the salience of images. So you can imagine now one big change would just be removing all of the pictures. So shrinking guest pictures, removing host pictures. And again, these are things that were on the table after our discussion. And the third is having more timely reminders, as I was mentioning, about like what is the discrimination policy and deciding when you should prompt somebody to be thinking about it. So after our research, we made these series of proposals. Other people made proposals too, and Airbnb ultimately commissioned a task force to think about what are the design choices that they wanted to proceed with. So they made a few main changes. One change that they had made was the plan to increase the number of properties using instant booking. The second was making people acknowledge a new discrimination policy that they developed. The third was helping people to find alternative lodging after being rejected due to discrimination. And the fourth, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about the problem, is developing a data science team to study this in more of an ongoing basis. I think here was a little bit of recognition that whatever changes they made, it's not going to solve all their problems in an ongoing basis, that they need to bake this more into the core managerial decisions that they were doing. And related to that, they started running a bunch of experiments where instead of just thinking about the narrow short run value, they started thinking about the impact that their design choices were having on discrimination as well. Just to give a sense of what this looks like on the platform, remember this is the image I showed for what a search looked like at the beginning of our project. We see the pictures of the host here. After the project, they ended up pulling the pictures of the host off of the main search page. So you need to click down further if you want to see a picture of the host. They have grown instant booking. They've experimented with a variety of different things. Now they have more than 2 million instant booking listings worldwide. They've tried things like financial incentives, defaults, and prompts. There is an ongoing policy and legal effort. So in 2017, California had come to an agreement that allowed, that made it easier for Airbnb users to file complaints, made it easier for the state to perform testing that sort of looked like the audit studies we were doing, and made Airbnb commit to continuing training and to further develop its anti-discrimination policies. Now, this question that had come up about the evolving landscape is an interesting one, because at some level we're left with a question about what is enough, like how much discrimination should a platform be able to keep? What is their obligation in terms of making design choices that would reduce it? So there have been studies that have replicated and extended our work in a variety of contexts, just to give a sense of what they're finding. Essentially, all the studies that have set out to look for discrimination still see that, unfortunately, discrimination does persist. People have documented this against same-sex couples in Dublin, Middle Eastern guests in Sydney, guests with disabilities. They were focusing on blindness and cerebral palsy. So I think that this does kind of occur in different ways in different parts of the globe, and Airbnb is still thinking about how to deal with all of that. Should also mention that the steps that Airbnb has taken sort of grown over time as they've realized that some of the most minor changes are unlikely to lead to dramatic changes in the level of discrimination. So to give one example, something that was off the table in the beginning but was on the table eventually was updating profile photos. So for those of you who have hosted on Airbnb, you might know that now it's a different policy with respect to what you see about a guest. So now, as of October 2018, they stopped showing pictures until after you've decided whether to accept or reject a guest. So just stepping back from this, when I reflect on kind of the evolution of this marketplace, I think it's something that platform designers are struggling with more broadly. These are pretty seemingly innocuous decisions on the surface. So deciding, oh, let me give more information to hosts and let them decide who to accept and who to reject. It was something that at the time clearly wasn't designed to increase discrimination, but it had this unintended consequence. The managers of Airbnb, I think the CEO of Airbnb has actually said as much, as that this is a blind spot that they had, and that they were a little bit slow to get to the issue because it wasn't even top of mind as an outcome they should be considering in their design choices. So for a market designer, you should be thinking about the implication of design choices. You should be thinking through market design and also bundle in choice architecture principles, because I think kind of small changes in the way a platform is designed could have pretty meaningful impacts on the efficiency and on the equity of a market. And finally, thinking about what the goal is. So maximizing your value, but in this case, thinking about what all the unintended consequences are here. When I reflect on Airbnb, they had actually been running thousands of experiments per year already. But the thing that I think went wrong in some of those experiments is that they were optimizing to a narrow set of outcomes. So short run value, as opposed to thinking about something that presumably is tied to some longer run value that they may care about, which is making sure that it's a marketplace that is in the long run going to reduce the amount of discrimination that's on it. I think that this implicit managerial preference is clear when you start to see at how things have evolved over time. And so I'll just stop there, and thank you. Okay.
Mike, do you want to answer the question that was posed about cross-country, cross-cultural discrimination? It wasn't my question, but you might want to answer.
So the data that we were looking at was in 5 cities across the US. So we tried to look at Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, South. So we picked 5 cities from around the US. We didn't find big differences in the extent of discrimination across the cities. Going in, we weren't sure exactly what to expect, because on the one hand, you may think there's different base rates of discrimination in different places, but on the other hand, these are all hosts who are selecting into using Airbnb, so they kind of are probably similar on some other dimensions. In terms of discrimination around the globe, and this is what I was mentioning when I was saying that our results have now been replicated in a variety of different settings. So I don't think that discrimination is something that's just unique to some subset of cities, but I think that the way that it manifests and some of the struggles that Airbnb has had depends on some of the constraints they're facing. So thinking about the norms in a different country, thinking about the legal systems in different countries, thinking about like the tolerance for discrimination in different contexts is something that they've sort of been active in thinking through how to address the problem.
So Mike, I have a question. I'm just curious, this is a really fascinating, interesting results. So do you have any idea like why Airbnb, they decide not to go with the instant booking at the beginning? It seems like just go with instant booking seems to be even more efficient matching, right? Like just you don't really have to deal with all these other things.
So the history of instant booking and of discretion on platforms is a pretty interesting one. So if you look back to some of the early struggles that Airbnb had, some of them actually pertain to, we have a case study from 2011 on this, to situations where hosts felt uncomfortable, like they were afraid somebody wasn't going to take good enough care of their place. And actually, in response to some of these early incidents, they decided that they were going to be more flexible in terms of letting hosts reject whoever they want. So since then, they initially had a penalty for hosts who would reject somebody in terms of you would be listed lower in the search order. Part of this 2011 incident, they actually got rid of that penalty and just said you should feel comfortable rejecting people for any reason. Then over time, they've reintroduced different versions of this penalty. At first thinking basically about what's going to create the most efficient market, but now thinking about what's going to lead to an efficient market, and also what are the implications for discrimination and other outcomes. So we have about 5 minutes left, I think. I think it would be great if there are questions for any of the panelists on any of the papers.
I'll pose a question. This is Joel. This is a question that was first prompted last night, but I see it again here. And I'm going to bump up to the sort of institutional level. Broadly speaking, institutions need to do two things. They need to create value and mitigate harm. Most of these technologies devote 99% of their initial energy to creating value. And any question of mitigating harm only comes up later. But it's not usually built into the architecture of the platform, of people sitting around saying, what social harm might we do and how do we mitigate that? And so, and I asked this question for all three of the panelists. To what degree might we be asking developers to anticipate social harm and take that into account? Or alternatively, after the fact, how much harder is it to attend to that once the app or the capability is out there?
So it's a great question. So is the question like kind of, is it harder to unwind some of the decisions after they've been made?
Right, and all three of the, the first two papers were more about research tools, but you can quickly see how those tools could be applied by business and could do harm, in ways that the developers might not have anticipated.
So I guess that there are kind of a few questions underlying all of this, and it does seem like what are if you're a company and you're thinking about how much you should be avoiding harm, it does seem some is based on the legal situation. And I could say in this context, there were kind of discussions after the research with different regulatory bodies that involved then Airbnb on what they were willing to do without having more rules imposed on them. But part of it is kind of a managerial question. And I think this attention mechanism, Hyunjin could speak to it in her context, but I would guess in all of these contexts, the fact that that these feel like blind spots even after the fact. So a manager at Airbnb who then realizes, oh, we made these design choices, they facilitated discrimination in a way I wasn't expecting it. Now, it seems like the one read is that maybe there's so the less favorable read would be that they were just saying that afterwards as an excuse, but you could imagine that they may have been better off from the beginning had they anticipated some of this if they were just thinking about long run value. And the question you're raising seems to be a much deeper one about how do you as a society create institutions to help avoid some of that. Hyunjin or Beibei, did you want to weigh in on that before we end?
So I guess to Mike's point, I think it's impossible to avoid all the harms at the beginning. I think a lot of these are just have to kind of through the empirical practice, and then the company realize that in the trial and errors, and then they just kind of improve over time. But I'm still optimistic about the new technologies in general.
Although, if I could, in some arenas, there is a stronger norm that users of technology are given voice with respect to the technology, both in its development and in its use. And so in a sense, a principle of attending to stakeholders who are impacted by technology and giving them voice might be an important principle to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be really interesting to see, to understand how different rules, sort of, I think going back to Mike's research, not just on platforms, but even in terms of what governs how firms grow and what might be in place might impact how they balance these different goals across time. But it does, I do wonder, I mean, at least in some of this research, the trajectories can completely vary in that case, where if you start by balancing some of these goals, maybe you will never even get to the point that those harms may be created, or maybe you would create another harm that sort of comes as a result from that. So I think it's really hard to know, you know, what the right sort of design might be to govern those processes.
Yeah, well, I'll just stop here then. So thanks for a great conversation, everybody, and thanks Hyunjin and Beibei for presenting.
I thank them too. And let me suggest that in this one instance, I've got to live by my creed, which is being agile. We haven't had the best possible opportunity to coordinate here. But what I would like to do in about 20 minutes or so is to see if we can quickly compile some quick reactions and maybe some suggestions about next steps in terms of where we go from here. Chris Dede has already suggested that maybe we ought to have regular meetups sponsored by PON, maybe broken down by groups. We can talk about that as well. But what I'm wondering, Laura, and I'm looking, there you are, on this is whether people will indulge me and allow us to have some very short 5-minute breakouts of 3 people each. And what I need to do is to share my screen and bring over a question that I'd like you to address. Bear with me, I haven't triggered this yet. So I want to share the screen. And just randomly, you'll be in a group with a couple of other people. If it turns out that we have a number that's not divisible by 3, Laura, just make a quartet someplace. But we'll really do this on a 5-minute schedule. I hope one of you will set a timer on your phone or whatever, so we come back here. And here's the question. We've been through, all of us have been through 4 sessions, 7 have taken place. So we're coming with somewhat different experience to this, all the better, I would say. But what was something you heard about, saw demonstrated or whatever, discussions of what may be around the corner and so forth? How can you use that in your own work, whether that is in teaching, whether it is in research, whether it's developing technology or computer-based training exercises? Maybe it's something you'd like somebody else to develop or invent. We'll take a more detailed poll afterwards, but in the coming days. But if you could enter your own personal response in the chat, that'd be great to kind of start that conversation. When we come back in 5.5 minutes after we close this process, I'd like to turn to the session chairs where we have multiple chairs, if one of them can take that role, just for one, at the most, 1.5 minute sum up in terms of where they would like to go. I do want to be mindful of the time. I suppose we can linger after 20 minutes, but let's assume that people have been dedicated and hardworking, and there's absolutely no shame whatsoever if somebody chooses to leave in 20 minutes. Sonia, well, you led off, so I think that you can lead us off here in terms of you were on board early in terms of helping us out. I think Samir has the finder's fee on that. But any quick first impressions from this session, something that you want to cogitate about and going forward? And I'm really asking for a tweet, not even a sonnet.
From my takeaway.
You're muted.
So my takeaway is that the computer scientists are often obsessed with building the perfect technology. So from the conversation, we feel that there is a sweet spot for using imprecise technology and still make a real world impact. There's some gaps where technology could have an impact.
Ethan, what's your take from this? And you have to unmute.
Yeah, yes, I hope I'm
people can hear me. What I take away from this is our questions about the use of AI. Obviously, AI is part of using language in the future, and it seems, if someone, as San just said, AI researchers look for the perfect, or I'm not sure the perfect is in the long term better for us than the imperfect. But this is a group with backgrounds that I don't usually interact with, so I appreciate doing this.
Terrific, terrific. Jim, you are both a panel chair and co-organizer of this with me. Thank you so much for your help on this. Any very quick first reactions to the conference? You got to unmute.
As a moderator of the panel on social media negotiation, I was struck not only by the themes that cut through the session, which were really learning about the world that's out there that can affect negotiation directly and indirectly, influencing parties there, and mobilizing supporters and finding ways to handle those who might be in opposition. Those were themes, and there was a lot both in the diplomatic and the corporate and the public examples that we explored. But what really struck me as this conversation went on, and as I was in other panels throughout the day, the managerial and institutional blind spots to the data that's out there and highly relevant. It is striking. There is really a lot out there that's potentially makes a significant difference. And at the same time, the cognizance of ethical and privacy concerns around this. I think that's a theme that was very close to the surface, certainly in the session I chaired and in each of the other sessions. And what I would say is I found the fact that there were very different units of analysis throughout the day, dyadic ones, full-on multi-party negotiations, online marketplaces, really interesting technologies for gathering data and all kinds of different data, from behavioral to social media to review sites to consumer behavior, and the technologies for analyzing this, some in real time, some after the fact, some measuring affect and so forth, other sort of graphical and clustering algorithms. There's really a lot out there, much of which was unfamiliar to me, and so the cross-disciplinary aspect I thought was a very rich a feature of what people brought to the working conference.
I think the punchline on this is that, and I think I said this in the last meeting, there are few polymaths among us. And this is kind of exhibit A for the importance of collaboration. People can bring different disciplinary perspectives, working in different contexts, whether it's teaching, research, development of material, and so forth. I see a couple more panel chairs. Mike Luca, who normally sits in my former office and upgrades the intellectual content of those four walls. Michael, what was your impression here?
So thanks for the office, Mike. So in our group, so we were also struck by the cross-disciplinary nature of this and impressed to see so many different groups involved. And we were excited about the implementation of new technologies in practice, but when we thought about the pragmatic and managerial frontier, we're also a little bit worried, and this came up, I think, in a few of the sessions, about the potential harms that are going to be created by new technology as well. So moving forward, we were thinking about how do we make sure that we're thinking through the distributional effects of new things as we're implementing that, to make sure that we're not just getting seduced by new technology and giving tech companies too much of a pass to the extent that they're creating some value, but also potentially harming people along the way. The types of issues that came up in our discussion were around privacy, around just managerial mistakes, disinformation, discrimination, and anti-competitive behavior. So when thinking about that, we were excited about the landscape, excited about the promise and efficiency gains, but also aware that there's a lot to be done to make sure that managers move forward with this in a way that's going to be inclusive.
Thank you. In a bit, I'm going to call on Susan Hackley and then go on for some last words. Samir, I think Mike's set the table pretty nicely for you there. What's your thought in terms of maybe some other domain you were not as familiar with that you found intriguing?
I mean, I was interested in many of the talks and learned a lot over the course of the conference. I was, in terms of my takeaway, I was thinking about the conversation that's taking place at 3 different levels. So one set of conversations was about how AI influences and changes the nature of negotiations between people. A second kind of theme was the negotiations that need to take place between AI and robots, for example, and people, right? So there's a second layer. And then the third is, as we institutionalize AI and all become like habituated to this world, how that begins to shift our own psychology, our own group dynamic in ways that are hard to anticipate right now. And so I sort of saw those 3 themes being woven through a lot of the discussions today.
Well, thank you, Samir. And it's interesting how those appeared early on in the conversation. I don't know that I've gotten Chris Dede in yet. Is that, am I correct on that, Chris?
Jean is going to speak for our session.
Okay, Jean.
Okay, so we were the learning technology session, and I think we generated a lot of opportunities for research, a lot of possibilities for using technology in the classroom. But actually, and the research on both of those pieces is very important to do, because I actually think the biggest challenge for our classrooms is prepping our students to negotiate and resolve disputes in this online world. How to negotiate effectively with agents or avatars that have algorithms inside of them and big data driving them. As Colin Rule suggested this morning, there's probably going to be fewer needs for direct negotiation in 10 years, 20 years, I'm not sure. He didn't put a time on it. But that it's going to be our students who are writing the programs that are taken over by these agents. So I think we need to do a better job of teaching theory to our students so that they can do those kinds of jobs. And I think we need to do a much better job than we have historically done in face-to-face classes in getting our students comfortable and indeed really facile and powerful in negotiating in a myriad of different online media.
Thank you on that. Is there any chair on whom I've not called yet? Going once, going twice. Susan, you've been involved with the program negotiation for more than a few years. Lucky us. What was new here?
Well, thank you, Mike, first of all, for coming to us with this really innovative idea and bringing these wonderful people into our community. And Jim, thank you for jumping on board with that. It's really been interesting, and I'm left with a couple of thoughts. I think of the Jeff Bezos Amazon story and how that mighty person couldn't figure out a way to deliver a message that was what most people wanted to hear. Yeah, we wanted those jobs in New York. And just what it says about these power imbalances and the incredible ability of tech and AI and social media to upset the apple cart. And for AI, I would say they should be careful about their reputation. I think people are still making up their minds when you say artificial intelligence, they think robots. I think they should be careful and not wait till the harm is done with the platform that's created. When Mike Luca talked about Airbnb, the immense damage that was done with discrimination, that can't be fixed. That damage is done. So my final thought is I would love to all come together with another conference where we brought all this energy and intelligence together to think about our elections and how artificial intelligence and tech and negotiation perhaps could do something to hope that we have fair elections with less discrimination and harm done. But thank you all so much.
I'd like to call on you, Gohan, and then I will claim the last word for now.
Well, thanks, Mike. I will just say very briefly, thank you all for being part of this conference. It's really a great pleasure to see you. Obviously, we would have loved to have done it in person, but PON is very proud to have sponsored this gathering. One general thought that struck me, and it's related to what Susan said, negotiations as a field has always been interdisciplinary. It's drawn from economics and law and all kinds of disciplines. But this conference illustrates why it's important in order to make advances, it needs to be even more broad in the tent. And so computer scientists represented here, ethicists, futurists, all those have got to be part of the mix in order to make further advances in the field of negotiation. And I really do want to thank Mike and Jim for convening us, and Lara for coordinating all of us, and Susan and James for making sure all the trains run on time. Last thing I'll say, and then turn it back to Mike, I do think that this conference will be one that people look back on and say there was real learning and a kind of an inflection point that allowed the field to move forward in very productive ways. In order to maximize the learnings, I want to just reinforce the need or the interest in the written project that comes out of it. And I know that Joel's going to be soliciting all of us for the articles. And I further understand there's a negotiation between Joel and Mike about when exactly those are due. Maybe you guys can do that via bots, but regardless, there will be due dates, and we hope to have the articles in print to commemorate what's been going on here and to continue the conversation going forward.
Yeah.
So thanks to all of you, and I'll turn it back to Mike for the last word.
Thank you. And on the particular thing, speaking as the editor emeritus, obviously the sooner the better for those articles. So I'm fully behind that. We just want to be practical on it. But Joel and Sylvia will take the lead on that. Let me echo the thanks to Jim, to Susan, to Laura, and other people too who've been behind the scenes on this. This has been a long time in the works for me when this came into my head. It had been 25 years since we had done anything like this. Getting my arms around it was possible only because I reached out to people that I didn't necessarily know, or like Samir hadn't known for a long, long time. And it has been so gratifying to see both old friends and new friends as well through this medium. I figured out, Guhan, that I'm pretty good at guessing ages. There was one presenter where I think I am 3 times her age. And believe it or not, that makes me feel good. It makes me feel good that these young people are doing such important work, and that our knowledge is going to deepen, and the contribution we can make in our research, in our teaching, and even in developing these materials will be advanced. So really pleased to be a long-time member of the program of negotiation, and I'm glad we've spread our wings in this. We will follow up with inquiries. We will pick up on Chris Didi's suggestion that we find some way of having regular chats, and we look to our fellow institutions like Haas, Samir, and Stanford, and Kellogg, and so forth that are working in these areas. Georgia Tech was represented as well. So now I think it's time to declare at least a modicum of victory, and to look forward to working together in the future. So thank you all very, very much.